On October 31st, 2018, Deltarune was released, the first of the 7 chapters Mr. Toby Fox promised us. 7 years have passed since then, and we're still asking ourselves the same questions. Who is the knight? What does the prophecy really mean? And above all, what the hell is in that bunker? Each mystery feels like a door to another empty room where nothing makes sense. But what if the key was to connect absolutely everything we know? What if the weird route isn't just an alternate path, but the masterpiece that finally connects it all? Think about this. The angel of the prophecy isn't a character we're waiting to meet. It's literally us fused with Noelle, which is something we already covered in our video about Noelle and her relationship with the weird route. On top of that, the Mantle minigame acts as a direct spoiler for the end of the game. Just like how Gerson Boom basically screamed in our faces that the prophecy we thought was unchangeable is in fact a story we can rewrite, and the most painful revelation. To get our perfect ending, the last obstacle in our path will be our friend, Susie. Do you see where this is all going? If we piece all of this together, we don't just get another theory, we get the theory, the one that finally connects to prophecy, our role as the player, and the fate of every character. Obviously, this is all based on what we know up to chapter 4, because Toby Fox could always go wild and reveal that the weird route was a troll path or something in chapter 5. But assuming he's not that crazy, I hope this video serves as a spoiler level preview of how the game could end. So let's start right there, with the ending and the true meaning of the angel. So, like any story, we've reached the end of this theory. The truth is, we don't have much material left to work with because nobody really knows how the weird route will end, for the obvious reason that the game isn't finished yet. Therefore, it's important to state that what follows will fall, for the most part, into the realm of fanfiction. So let's ask the question, how will the weird route end? And consequently, what will be the final fate of this coveted character, the angel? As discussed in the previous part, the angel is a character who has yet to appear, and I'm almost certain they are a union between the red soul that possesses Chris and Noelle. At the end of the weird route, we can see a kind of new soul beginning to form within Noelle. This might allow us to control her, making her a sort of second playable character, which would also be quite symbolic, considering the soul is aware of the player's existence. It's hard to know what happens next, but given the nature of the game, the Mantle minigame, and the way Toby Fox writes his stories, we can piece together a solid theory. You see, if there's one thing that defines Toby Fox's narratives, it's his effort to humanize his games as much as possible. Undertale, though it may feel more in the background these days, is still a clear example of this. It's an RPG that deconstructs many of the basic concepts of classic RPGs, taking literally the idea that killing is just killing. It's not just for fun, it's the horrific act it truly represents. Therefore, the game focuses its story on humanizing its characters as much as possible, so the player understands that they too have their own lives, and playing with them on the whim is as twisted and heartless as it sounds. This is how the genocide route becomes, literally, a route that only exists because the player wants to know what happens if they complete 100% the game. What happens if they destroy everything, simply because they're determined to do it, simply because they think it's fun. This is where many of the narrative concepts of Undertale, and also Deltarune, are born, with their meta-narrative nature. The game acknowledges the existence of XP in any traditional RPG, and transforms it into a sinister element. Our character gets stronger as they kill, but in doing so, they become distant from others. They become desensitized, and it dehumanizes the other characters, treating them as mere tools for entertainment. If any of this sounds familiar, it's because that's precisely what Mantle is about. Mantle is a very, very, very important game for this theory, as it's a direct parallel to what I'm describing. We are literally controlling a video game character, who in turn is controlling another video game character. In this context, Chris is a representation of us, and the Mantle minigame is about nothing less than that dehumanization I'm talking about. In the weird route, we literally treat Noelle as a vessel that allows our actions to matter. Basically, we want her to be our playable avatar, and we seek to defy the game's own prophecy. To put it more clearly, it's like switching from playing a Telltale game to Red Dead Redemption. The method for achieving this is, without a doubt, very peculiar. You see, as I mentioned before, the genocide route in Undertale is a kind of deconstruction of the typical RPG path where you spend the entire game grinding grinding for experience. In Deltarune, however, if we had to find the gameplay equivalent to base this route on, I'd say it's a reimagining of a generic creepypasta, the kind where someone discovers a secret path through glitches or bugs, and that kicks off a horror story. And the weird route is, strangely, exactly that, a route where the player performs certain actions they shouldn't be able to by exploiting small details. This is especially noticeable in the Mantle minigame, which represents this route. If you look closely, the entire minigame is based on breaking the game. To advance, you have to break the palm trees, which are part of the game's design. That is, the game's boundaries designed to guide the player through the story it wants to tell. Therefore, I think it's fair to say that the weird route is a deconstructive reinterpretation of a creepypasta, centered on the idea of breaking a video game by following an unintended path. This makes sense, given that one of the game's central themes revolves around fate, self-fulfilling prophecies, and determinism. By challenging these core themes, we end up breaking the game itself. However, once it's shown that a new soul is forming in Noelle, which we might be able to control, we no longer know anything for sure. From that point on, what will our true intentions be? Many believe this route will end in a sort of soft lock, which is possible considering Toby Fox has repeatedly said that Deltarune will have one ending. It could very well be that during this period where we start controlling Noelle, another character intervenes to stop us, returning control to Chris. However, I don't think that will be the case. You see, Chapter 4 of Deltarune deals with this very topic, how the prophecy works or doesn't, and the truth is, it's very vague. While many of the events it describes do happen in the game, like Tenna's demise or Lancer calling Rouse toothpaste boying, there are other elements that are frankly hard to trace or fit clearly, mainly the descriptions of the protagonists. The most notorious is the heroine, the girl with hope crossed on her heart. The heroine's description doesn't much resemble Susie, who is supposed to fill that role. Her hair is long, down to her waist, and she carries a sword. None of these characteristics really fit Susie, even though she is apparently the heroine mentioned. The same could be said for the strange description given to Chris as the hero. The cage with a human soul and parts. A human soul and human parts? Why specifically human parts? Wouldn't it be more logical to just say Chris is a cage for a human soul and leave it at that? This description much more closely resembles the vessel we create at the start of the game, since it's literally built from human parts. And it doesn't end there. Later on, we find something else quite strange. Love finds its way to the girl. This is a later description of the same heroine, and well, it could be interpreted that way. Maybe Susie finds love. But why does this silhouette have a heart, which of course reminds us of the soul, when the previous silhouette didn't? And what exactly is this mural trying to say? That Susie finds love? That Noelle finds love? Or could it mean that the love statistic, level of violence, finds Noelle and ends up possessing her, as a weird route seems to imply? But if that were the case, then why is there a prophecy that says the Queen's chariot cannot be stopped? That line refers to the part where we use the Queen's card to get delicious potassium, but that only happens on the normal route, not the weird route. So what does all this mean? If this is a prophecy that, in theory, cannot be changed, why does it seem to contradict what actually happens in so many ways? And all those answers can be found in the character of Gerson Boom. If you know anything about narrative, I assume you'll agree with me when I say that when a character is introduced and given significant screen time, it's to tell us something important. The fact that this character is introduced in the same chapter where we see this prophecy should already tell us something. But what does Gerson tell us? Gerson is essentially a character created to provide a ray of light amidst the dark fate our protagonists are witnessing. He is, in essence, dramatic relief. Someone who helps Susie to see that she isn't destined to be just a brute if she doesn't want to be. That if she set her mind to it, she could develop healing abilities as useful as Ralse's. Furthermore, Gerson is the author of Lord of the Hammer, a story based on or adapting the Deltarune prophecy. And in turn, Lord of the Hammer is the inspiration for Dragon Blazers. Wait a minute. A game based on a story based on a prophecy? What does that remind me of? A game controlling the character that we control. A game within a game. The important part about Lord of the Hammer is precisely Gerson's perspective on the story, and consequently on the prophecy. According to him, it's a tale open to interpretation and adaptation. In other words, the prophecy is nothing more than a set of elements that can be freely reinterpreted. So what does this mean for the idea that Deltarune will only have one ending? Well, it means it's a lie. Deltarune will have multiple endings. The same story, the same events, but interpreted differently. Take, for example, the angel banished will finally meet with its desire. If the angel is, at least in part, us, what is our desire? Well, that depends on what kind of player you are. Think about it. A casual player probably just wants to beat the game normally, without fighting the secret bosses or getting the shadow crystals. A pacifist player will play using the act button. Others will prefer to fight. And those who follow the weird route, well, their desire is for love to reach the girl. So, no, I'm quite sure the weird route won't end in a softlock. I'm convinced it will lead to a new ending, albeit one similar to what's narrated in the prophecy. And since the prophecy is a mix of elements that can be related to the weird route and others that can't, I believe that, just as Gerson said, it's a series of vaguely narrated events that can be interpreted in different ways, but that one way or another will end up happening. Now that we've explained that the weird route can indeed have an ending, the big question remains: what would that ending be? Here, we enter the realm of speculation, but considering there's another game based on this same prophecy, and it does have an ending, why not interpret what happens in it as a clue to what could happen here? Mantle is another interpretation of the prophecy, in this case, a representation of what happens in the weird route. However, Mantle is a complete video game, so it could very well be spoiling what will happen from now on. Again, it's another interpretation of the prophecy. Chris doesn't start their journey on a beach, nor do we use a key that takes us to a frozen island. But we have killed characters in the game in a way very similar to how the 8-bit Chris does in Mantle, and we also use a character with ice powers to freeze a bird. That's what I mean when I say you have to take the information from this minigame with a grain of salt. After using the character in the white coat with ice powers, there's no longer a clear parallel with what happens in Deltarune. So what comes next would basically be spoilers for what the weird route could become. The next level in Mantle takes place in a city similar to the one in Chapter 2, where we are accompanied by Rouse and Susie NPCs. The interesting part begins when we pick up the mythical sword that has been with us in previous levels to increase our LV, and with it we must kill these 8-bit avatars representing Susie and Rouse. Does this mean we'll kill Susie or Rouse? Maybe, but I'm more inclined to think that sooner or later, Susie will discover what's happening with the soul in Noelle, and when it's too late, at the moment we can control Noelle, this battle will probably take place. Why do I think this will happen beyond Mantle suggesting it? Mainly because of how the narrative is shaping up. Susie seems to be a character who was never contemplated in the prophecy. Noelle, apparently, was the heroine of this story, but Susie snuck into the plot, causing significant changes. That's why the part where Chris has to choose a partner was meant for Noelle, but Susie shows up instead. Susie is a character whose arc revolves around breaking others' expectations. In Chapter 1, she goes from being one of the protagonists to one of the villains. If the world sees her as the bad guy, she embraces that role. Similarly, the dragon representing her in Dragon Blazers isn't a hero, but the evil dragon, who will always be evil, and that's that. However, after befriending Lancer, something in her heart begins to change. She becomes friendlier, and eventually a friend to Chris. In Chapter 4, encouraged by Gerson, she stops seeing her healing spells as useless and gains self-confidence, developing a better healing spell. This shows that she can change, despite what others say or how they perceive her. That's why Gerson hands her the baton, letting her finish this story however she wants. On the other side, there's us, or the soul, a being seemingly summoned and trapped in a body that doesn't want to be controlled and doesn't want us to have too much will or initiative. We are its tool. However, it is precisely this desire to break away from what we've been told we are and what our role is that motivates a soul to undertake the weird route. We are not a tool. We are here to create our own story with our own character. That's what was promised to us at the beginning of the game, and that's why Susie, sooner or later, will confront us. She wants to create her own prophecy, and we want to create ours. It's a clash of wills that I'm sure will happen, especially because when the soul has enough influence to respond to Susie about what it was doing with Noelle earlier, it chooses to say nothing so its plans aren't ruined. In fact, given how thematic all of this is, it's very likely to happen at the end of the game. It wouldn't be surprising if, due to this clash of narratives, Susie ends up being our final boss. And I don't think Rousey or Susie will die at our hands in this hypothetical part of the game, but I do think something similar to what happened with Birdley could occur. Not dead, but gravely wounded. And with Susie and Rousey defeated, leaving only Noelle, we would have one mission left, the Angel's greatest desire to date, the bunker. Just like it happens in the Mantle minigame. The reason? Two, mainly. One, it's the most logical desire I can imagine. We've been waiting for almost 7 years to find out what's hidden in that damn bunker. Two, the bunker is something Chris doesn't want a soul to know how to reach. So it's logical that there's some resentment and a desire to finally discover what's in there. But before we get there, and as happens in the Mantle minigame, we would have to get through a kind of final dungeon, full of enemies that are very reminiscent of Deltarune characters. The white cat heads look like Catty, the dinosaurs like Alphys, and the horn monsters that breathe fire, well, like the Dreamer family. What does this mean? Are we going to start literally harming characters from the light world? As much like a creepypasta may sound, it's quite possible that this whole part is a representation of that. We now control an obedient character, and it might be during the festival, when all the monsters are gathered, that we can finally attack them. Or, on the other hand, since it seems to be love that levels up and makes Noelle stronger, strengthening the bond between her and the soul, perhaps this part consists of grinding to ensure Noelle loses more and more autonomy. In the Mantle minigame, we basically just grind for levels non-stop until we finally arrive, our desire, the final goal, the bunker. What's in that bunker? I don't know for sure. I don't think ERAM/Nightmare Boss is an exact representation of any Lightner. Honestly, I think Nightmare Boss is literally the Shadow Mantle, but how can that be? It's speaking personally to Chris. Yes, but let's go back to the same point. Chris here is a representation of us, and what Nightmare Boss is telling us isn't something deeply personal to Chris. It's telling us, literally, what we've done in the weird route. It's scolding us, mocking our actions. And since Chris represents us, the game is also speaking to us. Nightmare Boss works better as the literal Shadow Mantle we're meant to obtain, because it's a representation of this entire route. It's not just a rare item to get, it's literally the definition of a generic secret item from any RPG that requires a series of specific steps to be obtained. And upon obtaining it, the playable character walks off the screen and towards Chris as an act of rebellion. If this 8-bit Chris is a representation of our actions in the weird route, then well, as I said in the previous video, it's very likely the soul will rebel. The tragic irony is that, in the end, our choices never mattered.